When interpretation stops, structure reappears. Consider this carefully before anything else. What disturbs you is not the event in front of you, but the meaning you place upon it. This is not a comforting claim. It removes excuses. It also restores clarity. Events arrive without opinion. They have no intention toward you. They simply occur. The agitation you feel afterward is created later, inside the mind, when judgment begins its work. You are accustomed to interpreting immediately. You label what happens as unfair, threatening, disrespectful, or hopeful. This labeling feels automatic, but it is not compulsory. It is a habit. And habits, once examined, can be interrupted. When interpretation is suspended, even briefly, something precise returns. Order. Not emotional calm, but structural order. You see what is happening without adding a story about what it means for you. Stoic discipline begins here. Not with endurance. Not with positive thinking. With the recognition that events are neutral and that disturbance is manufactured by judgment. This does not mean you suppress feeling. It means you stop confusing feeling with truth. Responsibility cannot be transferred to circumstances, to other people, or to outcomes. The moment you assign blame outward, you surrender authority inward. This is a demanding position. It offers no comfort and no shortcuts. But it restores something essential, the boundary between what happens and what you do with it. When interpretation pauses, you are no longer dragged by impressions. You are placed back at the center of choice. Hold this distinction, the quiet boundary you keep crossing. Everything that follows depends on one clear distinction. There is a boundary in your life that is crossed so often you no longer notice it. When that boundary is ignored, effort becomes confused and discipline turns brittle. You feel busy, reactive, and strangely ineffective, even when you are trying to act well. The boundary is simple, but it is not intuitive. It separates what belongs to you from what never did. What belongs to you is limited and precise. Your judgments, your intentions, your choices, your responses. These are the only things that remain under your authority at all times. They do not depend on permission. They are not granted by circumstances. They cannot be taken by force. They exist wherever you do. What does not belong to you is far larger. Events, other people's behavior, outcomes, timing, reputation, recognition, the weather of the world. These things move according to causes far beyond your reach. You may influence some of them indirectly, but influence is not ownership. Confusing the two is where frustration begins. Most disturbance is not caused by hardship itself, but by misplaced responsibility. You speak as if results are owed to you because effort was applied. You speak as if others should behave differently because you behaved correctly. You speak as if the world is obligated to cooperate with your intentions. Each of these assumptions quietly assigns ownership where none exists. Consider a simple example. You prepare carefully for a conversation. You choose your words with restraint. The other person responds with irritation or indifference. Immediately, tension arises. Not because of their reaction, but because you believe their reaction was yours to control. When the result fails to match the expectation, judgment adds a second layer. This should not have happened. From that moment, agitation follows. Or consider delay. You plan your day. Something interrupts it. Traffic stalls. A response does not arrive. The delay itself is neutral. But you interpret it as obstruction, disrespect, or loss. Again, the mistake is not impatience. It is the belief that timing belonged to you. When that belief collapses, irritation fills the gap. Discipline fails wherever this boundary is blurred. You attempt to control what is not yours and neglect what is. You rehearse arguments in your head about how others should act, while ignoring the quality of your own assent. You focus on securing outcomes instead of governing judgment. Effort increases. Control decreases, This is why Stoic discipline begins with subtraction, not addition. You remove false claims of ownership. You stop managing what was never under your command. This is not withdrawal. It is accuracy. When responsibility is limited to what is truly yours, attention sharpens. Energy is conserved. You are no longer scattered across outcomes you cannot guarantee. Notice how often language reveals the confusion. They made me angry. This ruined my day. I can't be calm because of what happened. Each statement quietly hands authority away. Not as a dramatic decision, but as a habit of speech and thought. The Stoic correction is not to deny feeling, but to correct attribution. The event did not do this. Your judgment did. When ownership is precise, something stabilizes. You still act. You still prefer certain outcomes. You still engage fully with life. But you stop demanding control where only influence exists. You invest effort where it can actually operate. Judgment becomes the primary task again, not a background function running unchecked. This boundary is the foundation. Without it, no technique holds. With it, discipline becomes possible. This explains where effort is misplaced, but not yet how disturbance takes hold, the moment agreement is given. Now we look at what actually creates disturbance. What reaches your mind first is not judgment. It is impression. A sound, a delay, a facial expression, a message on a screen. These arrive automatically. You do not invite them. You do not choose their timing. They appear, fully formed, carrying a suggestion about what they mean. This part is not under your control, and Stoic discipline does not pretend otherwise. The critical moment comes next. After the impression appears, the mind moves to interpretation. It says, "This is bad, this is threatening, this is disrespectful, this matters more than it should." At that moment, you either agree or you do not. This agreement is called assent. And assent is the point where freedom either operates or disappears. Impressions arrive uninvited. Assent does not. This distinction is subtle but decisive. Feeling tension is not the same as agreeing with it. Feeling irritation is not the same as endorsing the thought that something wrong has occurred. Most people never separate these stages. The moment a feeling appears, they treat it as a verdict. Reaction follows immediately. The chain completes itself without inspection. Stoic discipline interrupts this chain. Not by suppressing impressions, but by delaying agreement. Between what happens and how you respond, there is a brief interval. Often no longer than a breath. In that interval, you retain authority. Once assent is given, the rest unfolds automatically. Emotion intensifies. Speech accelerates. Behavior follows the judgment that was accepted without review. Consider criticism. Someone speaks sharply. The impression arrives, this is an attack. The body tightens. Heat rises. None of this is chosen. But the next step matters. If you agree that you have been wronged, reaction becomes justified in your own mind. Defense, resentment, or withdrawal seem reasonable. But if you suspend agreement, another option appears. You can examine whether the words actually harm what is yours. Often, they do not. Or consider delay again. A response does not come when expected. The impression suggests neglect or dismissal. If you assent immediately, impatience grows. Stories form. But if you pause, you may notice that the delay contains no verdict. It is simply time passing. The agitation exists only if you confirm the interpretation. This is why Stoic writers insisted that assent is the true seat of responsibility. You are not accountable for the impressions that strike you. You are accountable for which ones you ratify. This does not mean the pause is always comfortable. Sometimes it feels like standing in uncertainty without resolution. But discomfort is not damage. It is simply the absence of premature conclusion. The mind resists this pause because it prefers closure. Agreement creates a sense of certainty, even when it creates distress. Suspending assent feels like loss of control, when in fact it is the recovery of it. You are choosing not to decide before the facts are clear. You are refusing to let the first interpretation dictate your state. Notice how quickly language reveals assent. This is unacceptable. This always happens. I can't tolerate this. Each phrase signals that agreement has already been granted. The Stoic correction is not to argue with the content, but to slow the process. Before you challenge the judgment, you must notice that you made one. Assent does not require force. It requires attention. A single breath can be enough to prevent reflex from becoming policy. In that breath, you remind yourself that impressions propose, but do not command. They offer a version of events. You decide whether to accept it. This is not passivity. You may still act firmly. You may still set boundaries. But action that follows examined judgment has a different quality. It is measured. It is proportional. It does not carry unnecessary disturbance with it. Understanding this mechanism does not create discipline, training without forcing the mind. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. They imagine discipline as pressure, as suppression, as gritting teeth and enduring what they dislike until something breaks or gives way. Under this view, discipline is something you apply only when things become difficult. It is reactive, exhausting, and dependent on mood. This misunderstanding is why discipline collapses precisely when it is needed most. Stoic discipline is not force. It is training. Training is quiet. It occurs before pressure arrives. It does not demand that you feel differently. It asks that you notice differently. The goal is not to eliminate impressions or emotions. The goal is to change your relationship to them. A trained mind does not panic at the appearance of feeling. It recognizes the feeling as data, not a command. Consider the difference between endurance and practice. Endurance is what you rely on when something has already gone wrong. You hold on. You resist. You wait for relief. Practice is what you repeat daily so that fewer things go wrong in the first place. Practice prepares attention so that when an impression appears, it is met by familiarity rather than surprise. This is why Stoic discipline emphasizes repetition over willpower. Willpower is unreliable. It fluctuates with sleep, stress, hunger, and emotion. Training does not depend on how you feel. It depends on what you repeat. What you repeat becomes accessible under pressure without negotiation. The object of this training is not behavior first. It is attention. You train yourself to notice impressions as impressions. You train yourself to detect the moment judgment begins to form. You train yourself to recognize the urge to assent quickly, especially when certainty feels emotionally satisfying. None of this requires force. It requires consistency. Notice how this reframes difficulty. When irritation appears, the task is not to remove it. The task is to observe it without granting it authority. When anxiety arises, the task is not to argue with it. The task is to refrain from endorsing its conclusions. Discipline is not emotional numbness. It is emotional literacy without submission. This training must occur when stakes are low. Waiting until a crisis to practice restraint is like learning balance during a fall. The Stoics were explicit about this. You practice with small impressions so that larger ones do not overwhelm you. A mild inconvenience becomes an opportunity. A minor delay becomes rehearsal. These moments are not obstacles to practice. They are the practice. Many people resist this because it feels insignificant. They want discipline to look dramatic. They want visible effort. But visible effort often masks internal confusion. True training is almost invisible. It looks like nothing happening. A pause. A breath. A refusal to conclude too quickly. There is also a moral misunderstanding that must be corrected. Discipline is not self-punishment. You are not correcting a failure every time an impression appears. Impressions are not mistakes. They are natural responses. The mistake, if it occurs, is unexamined assent. Even that is not an occasion for guilt. Guilt is simply another judgment added too late. Progress here is measured by speed of recognition, not by absence of reaction. You notice sooner. You recover faster. You spend less time entangled in stories that do not improve action. This is not perfection. It is calibration. Over time, this training changes the internal sequence. Impressions still arrive. Emotions still register. But the space before assent becomes familiar territory rather than an emergency gap. You know what to do there. You wait. You examine. You choose. This is discipline functioning as intended. The mind trained in this way does not need to be harsh with itself. It does not issue commands in moments of stress. It has already been shaped through repetition. When pressure arrives, it behaves according to what it knows, not what it hopes. Training remains abstract unless it appears in daily life, practice that requires no performance. This practice is proven in ordinary moments. Stoic discipline does not wait for significant events. It establishes itself in what you are tempted to dismiss as insignificant. The day you consider unimportant is the only place training can occur. If discipline is reserved for crises, it will fail there. Daily practice exists so that nothing dramatic is required when pressure appears. The first practice is anticipation without anxiety. You begin the day by acknowledging, plainly, that impressions will arise. Delays will occur. People will misunderstand. Plans will shift. This is not pessimism. It is accuracy. You are not rehearsing frustration. You are removing surprise. When the impression arrives later, it is recognized rather than resisted. You say to yourself, "This is what I knew would happen." The event loses its power to provoke because it no longer claims novelty. Anticipation becomes harmful only when it turns into storytelling. You do not imagine specific outcomes. You do not assign motives. You simply accept that the world will not arrange itself around your preferences. This prepares the mind to meet impressions without urgency. The second practice is the pause before assent. This is the core exercise. When an impression appears, you create a brief interval before agreeing with it. One breath is enough. In that breath, you ask a single question: does this impression concern what is truly mine? Often the answer is no. The impression may concern convenience, reputation, comfort, or outcome. None of these belong to you in the strict sense. When this is seen clearly, the impulse to react loses its justification. This pause is not passive. It is an active refusal to conclude prematurely. You are not suppressing response. You are postponing judgment. The body may still register tension. The emotion may still be present. But without assent, it does not escalate. It passes or stabilizes without carrying you with it. The third practice occurs at the end of the day. Review without praise or blame. You look back at moments where impressions arose. You note where assent was granted too quickly. You note where it was withheld. This is not a moral trial. It is a technical review. What was noticed? What was missed? Where did attention drift? Where did it hold? Guilt has no role here. Guilt is simply another unexamined judgment that claims error requires punishment. Stoic review requires no punishment. Correction is sufficient. You identify patterns so they can be recognized earlier tomorrow. Praise is equally unnecessary. Pride creates expectation. Expectation invites disappointment. Accuracy alone is the aim. These practices are deliberately modest. They do not demand time, equipment, or isolation. They occur while waiting, speaking, walking, reading. This is intentional. Discipline that depends on ideal conditions is not discipline. It is preference. Over time, these practices alter the texture of the day. Fewer moments feel urgent. Fewer impressions demand immediate resolution. You still act decisively when needed, but action arises from clarity rather than agitation. You begin to trust the pause. You stop fearing that restraint means weakness. The result is not constant calm. It is reliability. You know where to return when impressions press. You know what belongs to you and what does not. The day becomes a sequence of opportunities to apply this distinction, not a series of obstacles interrupting your intentions. When this practice becomes stable, a different kind of freedom appears, freedom that does not depend on ease. Freedom is often misunderstood. You are taught to associate freedom with comfort, choice, and favorable conditions. When obstacles are removed and outcomes align, you feel free. When pressure appears, freedom seems to disappear. Under this definition, freedom is fragile. It exists only when circumstances cooperate. Stoic discipline rejects this entirely. The freedom that remains after training is not comfort. It is sovereignty. Nothing about this freedom guarantees ease. Life does not become smoother. Inconvenience continues. Loss remains possible. Other people remain unpredictable. What changes is not the surface of experience, but the location of authority. You no longer search for freedom in outcomes. You locate it where it has always been available, in judgment and assent. This is why Stoic freedom cannot be taken by force. Events can restrict movement. They can limit options. They can impose difficulty. They cannot compel agreement. They cannot command judgment unless you grant them permission. When you stop interpreting reflexively, events lose their power to dictate your internal state. Notice the precision here. Freedom does not mean you are unaffected. You still register impressions. You still experience preference and aversion. But these impressions no longer rule. They inform without commanding. You are affected, but not governed. This distinction matters because many people mistake emotional calm for freedom. Calm is pleasant, but it is unstable. It depends on conditions remaining favorable. When conditions shift, calm dissolves. Freedom, as Stoicism defines it, does not dissolve under pressure. It becomes more visible there. Consider constraint. You are delayed, restricted, denied an outcome you prefer. Under the old model, freedom is lost. Under the Stoic model, freedom is tested. The question becomes simple: can you still govern judgment? Can you still choose response deliberately? If you can, freedom remains intact even as comfort disappears. This is why Stoic freedom is not an achievement. It is maintenance. There is no final state where vigilance ends. Authority must be exercised repeatedly. Each impression invites judgment. Each judgment invites assent. Freedom exists only so long as this process remains examined. This can feel unsatisfying to those who want resolution. They want a moment where the work is finished. Stoic discipline offers no such moment. It offers something else: stability across changing conditions. You do not become invulnerable. You become less dependent. This form of freedom also corrects a common moral confusion. You stop blaming others for your internal state. This does not mean others behave well. It means their behavior no longer determines whether you retain command. Responsibility returns inward, where it can actually be exercised. There is restraint here, but not withdrawal. You still engage with the world. You still pursue goals. You still act with preference. The difference is that outcomes are no longer confused with identity or worth. Success does not inflate authority. Failure does not remove it. This is why Stoic freedom feels quiet. There is no triumph in it. No display. It does not announce itself. It appears as steadiness, as proportion, as the ability to remain present without being pulled into every interpretation that arises. When this freedom is understood, the demand for comfort loosens. You stop negotiating with circumstances for permission to be composed. You stop waiting for the world to improve before you act well. Authority is exercised now, not later. Nothing outside you must change for this to begin. This brings us to the final responsibility, where responsibility finally rests. The conclusion is simple. Nothing in this practice allows responsibility to be transferred. Not to circumstances. Not to other people. Not to past conditioning. Each time you interpret reflexively, you hand authority away. Each time you pause before agreement, you take it back. There is no middle ground where responsibility is shared. It either remains with you, or it is surrendered. This is not a claim about control over life. It is a claim about control over judgment. Life will continue to present difficulty. You will still make errors. You will still assent too quickly at times. Stoic discipline does not promise immunity from this. It demands that you stop pretending these moments remove responsibility. They do not. They simply mark where attention lapsed. Imperfection requires no justification. It requires correction. The temptation at the end of any discipline is to soften its demand, to look for exceptions, to explain why this moment was different. Stoicism refuses that comfort, not out of severity, but out of clarity. If responsibility could be outsourced under pressure, it would never truly belong to you at all. What you retain after all interpretations fall away is modest but decisive. The ability to choose how you assent. The ability to delay agreement. The ability to act without adding unnecessary disturbance. This does not make you superior. It makes you accountable. Order returns when interpretation stops because reality is simpler than the stories you place on it. Events happen. Impressions arise. Judgment follows if invited. When you interrupt that invitation, you stand in what is actually yours. Not peace. Not control of outcomes. Authority. This authority must be exercised repeatedly. There is no final state where the work ends. But there is also no moment where the work is unavailable. The pause is always accessible. The distinction is always present. What belongs to you never leaves. The work is simple. It is not easy. And it is yours. Return to what is yours.